So what I'd like to do is just jump right into this sustainability nutrition part 8, because we had, up until now, we've done these 7 parts. We did sort of the basics of sustainability. We did animal husbandry. We did oops we did agriculture, we did waste, we did water, we did energy, we did seafood, we did all 7 of those parts, where we really took the world of sustainability and sort of cut it up into 7 pieces. At the same time, we also learned through that curriculum that everything is combined, that everything is interwoven. You can't talk about agriculture without thinking about energy, water, and waste, etc. And this part 8 really just sort of is the natural continuation of parts 1 to 7. And really, if we think about how did many of us learn about how did we learn about nutrition? And maybe in culinary school you learned it, and maybe you didn't. But this is the thing: a lot of people, what happened is that people sort of said, okay, nutrition is something you learn, and then it sort of sits over here. And for many of us in our professional worlds, we didn't really think about nutrition. I mean, our job was to make the customer happy. That's what we were supposed to do. And we didn't really think about their well-being, much less the well-being of the planet. And so where this all fits together, and you'll see that the name of part 8 is sustainable nutrition. And what we're looking at is a very simple fact that we're going to see over and over and over again in this presentation. And that is, you can't really talk about sustainability without talking about nutrition, and vice versa, because what we've discovered is that what's good for me from a nutritional standpoint is also good for the planet from a sustainability standpoint. And that's a very interesting piece of information, and the information that this entire presentation is built off of. In other words, nutrition is not just a separate topic that sort of lives over here somewhere on the side, but rather it's part of really living a sustainable lifestyle. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the presentation. So this is a slide that really takes a look at meat consumption per GDP, per capita. So in other words, and you can see there's this line that sort of goes up to the top right on your screen. And what it's really demonstrating is that the richer a country is, the larger the meat consumption is. And so we're going to talk about later on this presentation, like, what are traditional diets like? And is it something that should be aspired to? In other words, as a country gets richer, should we be consuming more meat? Because the other side of meat consumption is, in terms of what it does for us individually in terms of nutrition, is that if you look at, for instance, the United States, and I'm using the United States because I live here, but you can see the dot on the top right corner there in terms of meat consumption, as it is in terms of the amount of sort of the GDP, or the measure of richness, I guess, of the country. You can see that dot up there. And what does that mean for us here in the United States? The estimate is that by 10 years from now, 50% of the population of the United States will be considered obese. And that means, dramatically overweight. And currently, over 500,000 Americans die every year of diseases that are linked to poor diet. So you start to scratch our head and say, okay, so as we get more money, we consume more meat, but at the same time, our health is also declining. And of course, if we look at this from the sustainability standpoint, we look at meat production. This is something we've talked about before, but you can look at, the chart on the left is greenhouse emissions, and you can see what happens when we take a look at things like lamb and beef production versus something like lentils. Huge difference in the impact to sustainability, to the environment. Or you can look on the right side at the amount of water that's used to produce certain proteins. Again, beef, really high. But then if you look at other things, into the vegetable world, all of a sudden what happens is that starts to go down dramatically. So, and in other words, if you take the last slide and this slide, it really demonstrates how eating a healthy diet and for those of us who are chefs to be cooking diets that are more healthy for our customers helps them from an individual nutrition standpoint and helps us from a planetary health standpoint. So let's take a look at these very simple sort of definitions, if you will, because what we're going to see in this is that, you know, not all diets are created equal, and not all calories are created equal. And in fact, we have to think very closely about how we're consuming those calories. So first of all, a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie. Now, of course, what is a calorie? A calorie is very simply a unit of measure. It doesn't tell us anything about the quality. It's just a measure of energy. So very simply, if you eat more calories, you gain weight. That's just very simple mathematics, because it's this whole concept of calories in, calories out. So if we're eating more calories, we're going to gain weight unless we have a way to really, truly work those calories off. Now, again, a calorie is not a calorie is not a calorie. How our bodies metabolize those calories is very different depending on what the calorie is or where the calorie is coming from. In other words, I can get calories from consuming a piece of cherry pie. I can also get calories from eating a bowl of cooked lentils. And in theory, I could actually get those portions to be the same. So I have the same amount of calories, but when those calories go in my body, they're going to do very different things. So we want to think about not just looking at total overall calorie consumption, which is important, but we also want to take a look at what those calories or where those calories are coming from. Because as we've seen, that has an impact on me, the individual, and it has an impact on the environment. Again, we're going to see this over and over and over again. So we can't divorce these two. We can't separate these two. And we're going to take a look later at the Eat Lancet report because that really spelled it out very succinctly in terms of this whole concept of me, the individual, and us as a collective, as humans, the human species on the face of the earth. So again, we can't divorce the two. The stuff that's healthier for us tends to be healthier for the environment with a lower footprint. Now, this is a kind of an interesting slide here, because on this slide, what we're really taking a look at, let me go ahead and do that and that, is we're taking a look at the fact that over time, the diets in the world have not really shifted dramatically in terms of the percentages. In terms of if we take those diets and break them down into, for instance, you know, proteins and carbohydrates and fats, etc., that hasn't really changed. In other words, where am I getting my energy from the food that I eat? And as you can see, there is this socioeconomic development index, which is the SDI, listed there on those two red circles. And so you can see the higher one, or the one at the top of the screen, is really more about sort of richer countries, and you can see how those diets break down, as opposed to countries that are less affluent, which are on the bottom. And you can see also how that sort of breaks down. But and also you can notice that the total calorie content is different per day, which is really interesting, because when we talk about things like obesity, you know, again, obesity tends to link up oftentimes with a higher GDP. So this is a kind of an interesting slide to take a look at, because on this slide, what we're really seeing is that when we look at the risk factors, if we look at the risk factors for, you know, our health, right at the very top is the dietary risks. And this is something we're going to take a look at throughout this presentation. But if we think about how do we improve our health, you know, people talk a lot about, you know, lots of different things we can do to improve our health. But the reality is the number one thing we can do is to look at the diets that we're consuming, whether that's a pescatarian diet, whether it's Mediterranean, whether it's vegetarian, and we're going to talk about all those in a little bit. I mean, like vegetarian, for instance, excuse me, Mediterranean is really a style of eating that's based on the traditional cuisines of the Mediterranean, those that border the Mediterranean Sea. And it's not like there's a single definition for it, but it tends to be a diet that's high in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, nuts, seeds, and especially olive oil. If we look at that, what does that mean for people who are living those diets, the Mediterranean diet, vegetarians, etc.? There's some really interesting statistics that feed into that top blue bar there, the dietary risks. And so, for instance, you can reduce type 2 diabetes by 16 to 41%. I mean, that's a substantial reduction. You can reduce the risk of cancer by 7 to 13%. You can reduce the risk of coronary heart disease by 20 to 26%, all by changing our diet, by living this Mediterranean diet, by living a pescatarian diet, by living a vegetarian diet. So it's a powerful thing for us to think about, because it's time that we as chefs not only think about, is this food good and does it put a smile on our customer's face, but as we've talked about in previous presentations, it's also about, is the food on that plate sustainable for our planet? But I think we also need to think about, and is it healthy for the person we're serving? Again, it tends to be all the same thing. So what we're going to do on the next number of slides here, just to kind of level the playing field a little bit, is to talk about the basic building blocks of human nutrition. Now, for some of you, I'm sure for many of you, this is going to be, kind of like, yeah, I've heard this before. But nonetheless, I think it's important that we do this. And for those of you who are thinking about, using this to actually teach other folks, these are important slides, because we can't really have a discussion about sustainability without talking about what are the about nutrition, without having a basic discussion of what nutrition is. So the first thing is proteins. And so what are proteins? Where do they come from? Proteins are basically strands of things called amino acids that are put together in there's 20 different amino acids. Some are essential, some are non-essential. And then basically every protein out there is kind of like like a train, if you will, of different amino acids that are lined up, and then it gets twisted into different shapes. That's a super fast definition of a protein. But I think the bigger points here is that, number one, you can see on the bottom left that we don't actually, as human beings, need a lot of protein to live our lives. I mean, to be healthy. There's a whole separate thing for very, very young children who need a lot of protein because they're building they're building their bodies and growing. But for those of us adults, we don't actually need to consume as much protein as many of us consume. And secondarily, if we think about proteins in general, we tend to hear the word protein, and as chefs, we tend to go to, oh, well, that means, poultry, meat, seafood. Well, let's also remember that when we talk about proteins, we're also talking about the vegetable or plant kingdom, and there's many, many sources of protein. In fact, protein is throughout the plant kingdom, but there are certain foods, beans, legumes, etc., that are super high in protein. So I think it's important that we start to separate that when we hear protein, it's not just an animal source, but it's a plant source. And in fact, maybe it's even better to start to say animal protein and plant protein, because we separate the two. So fats are an essential part of our diet. Fats do a lot of things for us. I mean, chefs, we know this, right? I mean, fats make foods taste good. They carry certain flavors or carry certain nutrients. It gives us that mouthfeel. It creates satiety or fullness in terms of, those of us who are eating. But I think the important thing here to recognize is that a fat is not a fat is not a fat. So you have, saturated fats and the hydrogenated or trans fats. Those are things we want to avoid. But at the same time, having a diet that's devoid of fat or very, very low in fat sometimes isn't such a good thing either. But here's the thing. The fats we want to be consuming or should be consuming are those monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats. And we're not going to get into the difference of what those are, but that really is where our focus needs to be. I will also say, and sometimes this gets, people get confused on this, and it's when we hear, monounsaturated fat, the idea is those are healthy fats. Absolutely they are. But let's also remember that fat is one of the most dense forms of consuming calories. And in other words, all fats carry the same caloric amount as all the fats. It's not that somehow if I put olive oil in my food, therefore I'm getting less calories. Not true, but it's the quality of the fat that matters. And of course, then we get into sugars. Now, sugars are really slash carbohydrates. This is a big area of discussion because a carbohydrate is not a carbohydrate is not a carbohydrate. We want to focus on things that are complex carbohydrates because those do a lot of really important things for us and in terms of our sugar load, etc. So we want to focus on those. So we focus on whole grains. We want to focus on minimally processed ingredients. And as we go through this, and we're going to get into sort of very much menu focused ideas and really like how do we do this as chefs. But this is where when you hear stuff like people saying we have to eat more whole grains, a lot of times people sort of interpret that as do we have to? But no, that's where we as chefs, it's our job, and frankly it's a challenge to kind of take those and make them taste amazing, which we can do. So just some things for how we approach this. Number one is, again, focus on those whole grains. We want to sort of avoid the sugar sweetened beverages. Instead, how can we work with waters and make those waters interesting by putting fruits or infusions into it? Desserts that focus less on heavy and more on things like fruits and dark chocolate, nuts, etc. And then this idea of flip, which we're going to talk about a lot more later. And a flip is how do we flip the menu over? And so what we do now is we focus on things like more of the fruit and less of, in this example, the cheesecake, for instance, which is going to bring with it a lot of fat. So how do we sort of balance that? Again, never taking away from flavor, never taking away from the customer's enjoyment. Now, one sort of last piece here on information. Where do we learn about nutrition? And when we were building this PowerPoint presentation, this is something we talked a lot about because, there's a lot of really crazy information on the web out there, a lot. And so we have to be absolutely certain that what we're getting is real information, or as we say here in the United States, it's not fake news, right? So as you look at the internet, there are some organizations on the right there which are going to offer you true scientific information that's been vetted through other scientists. And then, of course, on the left are some basic questions to ask. If you hear something on the web, if somebody says, oh, if you just eat this, it's going to do this. Where's that coming from? Who paid for that? Is it a reputable source? What are their credentials? Who funded the research? Go through all of this. Is it peer reviewed? Because we want to be certain that as chefs, we have the correct information because we take that information and we act on it. And so it has to be true, credible scientific information. So now let's kind of start looking at how. So we've learned a little bit about the fact that nutrition and sustainability are linked. We've learned a little bit about the building blocks of nutrition, but then really let's bring it into our world, the world of the white jacket. How do we do this? How do we cook in a way that's more nutritious and sustainable at the same time? So first of all, just a couple quick definitions here. And these are very hot terms right now that are used a lot in the chef world, and rightly so. The first is plant forward. What plant forward means is a menu that features, it does have things like meat on it or fish, but it's much more plant focused. In other words, the fish, the animal protein starts to become a smaller and smaller and smaller part of the menu, even to the point where it becomes a supporting element and not the main element. And then plant-based is now we're talking about vegetarian cuisine. Now we're talking about food that is solely based on plant sources. So there's two different definitions there. The plant forward is sometimes called flexitarian as well. And both are really, really good, valid strategies. So this is kind of an interesting slide, which is really, encouraging us to think about traditional food, to think about the foods that were that were cooked and enjoyed by our ancestors, things that are traditional in terms of where we live. And many times what we're discovering is that the answers are right in front of us. Because as we look back, a lot of the sort of traditional foods and dishes were actually very plant focused, and consuming large amounts of meat, large amounts of fat wasn't really what was done. And so, one of the encouragements I give to all of you, wherever you're living throughout the world, is yes, it's fun to look and see what other people are doing around the world, but it's also important to ask the question is, do we want to follow that example or not? And instead, take a moment and look at where you live. I mean, it's that whole locavore, hyper-local trend that we've seen for the last, 10 plus years. But really now we're looking at it from the standpoint of, so what does that mean from a nutritional standpoint and from a sustainability standpoint? So again, take a look inward and see what you're doing there. Again, the answers are many times right in front of our face. So we also have tools that are available to us as chefs, tools to help sort of make the world of nutrition into something that's a little more manageable, because nutrition is its own scientific study. And most of us on this webcast, I presume, are probably not nutritionists. We weren't schooled in that as science. So it's helpful for us to have these sort of tools available that make it sort of simpler, something for us to follow. So the first is this Mediterranean diet, and I'm sure you've seen these pyramids out there. It's really keeping it simple for us. And it's also, sort of looking at, what does that Mediterranean diet mean? We've heard a lot about it. Again, you can look through this. I'm sure you've seen it before. It's less sweets, meats, etc., all the way down to the bottom where we're eating lots more plant-based. There, is a small allowance for alcohol, and really that other big piece is the physically active piece. And the one that I was just reading through these this morning that I sort of took a pause at is enjoy meals with others. And that in this time has been challenging. But I'm optimistic that 2021 is going to be a much, much better year. So hopefully we get back to that part. Here's a couple other tools that are available to you. The one on the right comes from the Harvard Medical School, and you can sort of see again another sort of it very much follows the Mediterranean diet, but it looks at a plate. And so how should we be dividing up our diet? The one that I would give to you to look more at is the one on the left. And that is the Eat Lancet report that came out last year, which really was, or maybe it was the beginning of this year. I'm losing my years now. And it was just monumental in terms of not only the depth of information there, but really a great tool to take a look at what you're doing in your country and see how does this fit. Because if we look at that sort of that pie chart on the left, that's what we should be doing on a global basis to ensure sustainability, to ensure planetary health. And of course, also, as you look at that, that's very much what we've seen in the Mediterranean diet, etc. And it's a great representation of the fact that, again, our nutrition is planetary nutrition. But the interesting thing that the Eat Lancet report does is it sort of takes a look at, well, how do different countries line up on this? And I will say that we here in the United States, we don't line up at all with this. And you'll see, that the amount of dairy we consume and animal protein is way out of proportion. So again, a great tool. And I will also just a shout out to this report. There's a whole section in there that are just, sort of suggestions for food service professionals. It is hugely, hugely important. So let's sort of take a look now again at how we do this. Okay, how are we going to look at our menus differently? How are we going to make food differently? And so it goes a little bit like this. So again, some other definitions, some things that we're going to look at in upcoming menu examples. So flexitarian, that's that plant forward we talked about before. And flexitarian is really like we're trying to eat a lot more plants, and plant-based sources are a much greater percentage of what we're cooking, and animal-based sources are much smaller. And then, of course, vegetarian. Vegetarian is vegetable. I'm just consuming vegetables, and most of the time, things like eggs or dairy will fit into a vegetarian diet. Again, that there's different definitions there, and excuse me. And the other one is, of course, vegan. And vegan means absolutely no animal sources whatsoever. Everything is 100% plant-based. In that case, dairy is not part of that. Eggs is not part of that. So it's 100% vegetarian, excuse me, plant-based. Okay, so here's some ideas. How do we do this? The first is, and I'm sure many of you have heard about this, the Meatless Monday. And Meatless Monday is basically a campaign that's been out there for a bunch of years to challenge us as consumers and also restaurants to make your Monday menus plant forward and, in fact, plant based. So that the idea here is that it becomes something that you can introduce into your restaurant, and your customers just know that, hey, on Monday the menu is a little different. And of course, it's your job as a chef not only to make the menu different, but to make it, delicious. The really great thing about Meatless Monday is that everything is already out there. So you don't have to invent anything. As you can see on the right, there's posters, etc. I mean, everything is there for you to use, and you can use it in your restaurants. And one of the great things here is it's also an opportunity to try to bring in a different clientele than maybe who are coming to your restaurant every day. And of course, once we get past these COVID times and we can open up our restaurants, who doesn't want to have a different demographic coming into their restaurant to basically increase the number of customers overall? Because if people come in on Monday because of Meatless Mondays, they may then ask the question about, well, what else do you do that's plant-based or plant-forward the rest of the week? And you may then get additional customers. So a great campaign. I'm a big fan of it, actually. So here's another one. Let's rethink the amount of proteins of animal proteins on our menu. And what can that look like? So on the left, you sort of see this pie chart of what a menu should really look like as we think about, and this is really this is where we are. We need a paradigm shift in how we construct our menus. So many of us grew up in this world of, I start with an animal protein, and that's in the center of the plate. And then I think about, should I put a couple vegetables there? But everything is focused on that animal protein. We need to kind of blow up that way of thinking entirely. And when we do, it opens up a brand new way of creative cooking, which frankly is exciting. So what can that menu, or what should that menu look like? So on the left, you can see there's that pie chart. And you can see that 40% is kind of like, let's look at vegetarian, vegan, or maybe some very, very much plant forward. And then you're going to see this 50% of the protein flip. And this is where what we're really doing is we're asking that question about, how can we look at the vegetable, the plant-based thing, the grains, etc., as very much of the focal point of our menu items. And maybe we add a little less of the animal protein in there, or maybe just a little bit, or maybe we cut the animal protein. As you can see, the burger blend is a great idea for how we can actually make a really nice hamburger, but at the same time reduce the amount of overall overall animal protein in there. And then you can see on this one, there's those two little slivers over there, which are 5% smaller red meat entrees and 5% of the celebratory red meat. And that's that sort of big steak. But notice it's a much smaller part of our menu. And what I like about this actually is that it doesn't necessarily discount the fact that some people want to have a big piece of meat. We can take that off our menus completely, or maybe for your clientele, that's not an option. Maybe it just needs to be a smaller part of our menu. Maybe it needs to be at a different part of our menu instead of the first thing people look at. Because as you know, as chefs, if you make really delicious dishes, things that sound really cool and plant forward, people will tend to order them because it sounds interesting and creative and delicious. The other thing is just to take a look at, again, this is sort of what we talked about on the right, instead of serving a big piece of meat, how can we use that same amount of meat in different dishes? I should say the same meat, but in smaller portions in different dishes. And at the same time, as you can see from those dishes, they look great. They look delicious. And of course, the animal kingdom, or excuse me, plant kingdom is unbelievably complex. I would always, when I was in the world of culinary education, I would tell our students, like, so how many things can you do with a filet mignon? I mean, really. And if you start to sort of think about it, I can poach it, grill it, saute it, smoke it, roast it, and you start to run out of options pretty quickly. How many things can you do with a potato? How many things can you do with cauliflower? How many, and the reality is the plant kingdom is unbelievably complex. And there's this little piece on the chemistry of broccoli. Plants are not these simple species. They're very, very complex, and as a result they bring lots of different flavor profiles that we can play with. So for instance, one of the ways to make plant-based food really taste great, and one of the things that's oftentimes missing, is umami. And umami is, again, that's our fifth taste. There are many, many ways to get umami into food. Basically, umami is in just this like half-second chemistry lesson here. Basically, all umami is this one amino acid called glutamic acid, or glutamate, and when that bumps into our taste receptors for umami on our tongue, it shoots a message off to our brain that is delicious. And what umami brings us is this meaty, kind of savory impression. And what it does to grains and vegetables, plant-based dishes, is it makes them taste richer and deeper and more satisfying. So if you're cooking plant-based food, really think about, what about the umami levels in the dish? Because when you up the umami, it just tastes that much more satisfying. How do we get umami into dishes? Again, there's lots of foods that are very high in glutamic acid or glutamates. Things like, as you can see here, miso roasted carrots. Miso has a lot of it. Soy sauce has a lot of it. Sun-dried tomatoes has a lot of it. Dried shiitakes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other way to bring it into your food is through the use of MSG. A lot of people say, oh, I don't know about MSG. MSG is very simply the salt form of glutamic acid. So it's the glutamate in MSG is exactly the same as the glutamate you get in something like soy sauce or miso. And that's another way of upping the umami with just a sprinkle of MSG. The other thing that's kind of interesting is you can see in the middle here, and I love this photo, and I'm dying to go to this winery in Uruguay. As a side note, they make really good wine. But anyways, the interesting thing here is that the smoky, charred, and grilling notes to plant-based food is again adds layers of complexity of flavor, and many times actually in combination with umami makes it taste that much more satisfying, rich, and full. So again, it's strategically something to think about. At the same time, there are lots of tools out there. We talked about the tools like pyramids and plates and pie charts before, but this is a really interesting thing that this is a software company in Belgium, and what they're actually doing here is they're demonstrating how certain vegetables pair with other flavors. And what's kind of curious about this is done on a very scientific level, but things like this, or just excuse me, taking the time to go and research, what can I do with white asparagus, or what can I do with cabbage, and really going to the web and looking at all the creative ideas, it helps us kind of stretch. It helps us to get outside of maybe the habits of thinking about, well, this is what I do with cabbage, and these are the flavors that I put with cabbage. Have you tried cabbage with orange zest in it? Or have you tried it with miso? Or have you tried smoking cabbage? Or, and what that does, and what programs like this do, is they stretch our ideas. And, as creative chefs, that's kind of fun when we start to think about what are all the things that we could do with the lowly cabbage. So very, very neat. So how do we look at our menus? And you know, again, this presentation will be available for all of you later, because this is kind of like a checklist a little bit. So, you know, as we look at our current menus and we're thinking about this paradigm shift to healthier food and at the same time more sustainable food, how do we do this? So, you know, we look at animal proteins. Should they be listed first on our menu, or should they be sort of, you know, let the vegetables and grains be the rock stars? Um, Animal proteins should, you know, what are the portions we're serving? Can we make it much, much smaller? You know, what about those whole grains? How can we bring them into our foods? And, you know, interestingly, I think about some of the places I've been to in the world that still cook the traditional whole grains and legumes that they have always cooked. And I remember eating in some of these restaurants and just being blown away at how good these are. So we need to bring those back, and again, many times look inward at our own cuisines. Seasonal vegetables. We've talked a lot about, you know, that in the when we talked about the you know, about agriculture. You know, how can we work with local farmers? How can we, you know, cook just seasonal when vegetables are at their peak in terms of, you know, we don't have to transport them so far, we don't have to hold them so long. That's about energy and water, etc. And at the same time, if they're fresher, they're more nutritious. So how do we link that all together? Again, everything is combined. And to look at sodas and to look at desserts and how we can change our pastry menu and challenge our pastry chefs to think about what they're doing a little different as well. So this is a really cool example, a wonderful restaurant in Barcelona. And it's a little bit hard to read the menu on the left. So on the right, you can kind of see how they've done this. And it's really, again, talk about paradigm shift. So you open up the menu and what you see is, instead of it saying filet mignon or whatever, you see butternut squash. That's the rock star, okay? And then you can choose your butternut squash based on 3 different concepts. So the first line is vegan. The second line is vegetarian. And the third line is plant forward. So now we're putting a little bit of animal protein in there. So for every one of these vegetables, it's divided up and presented the same way. So, you know, leeks the same way, cauliflower the same way. Now, honestly, I mean, as you read through this, I mean, chefs, doesn't this make your mouth water? I mean, you know, a leek, I mean, you know, black garlic, yuzu, you know, root vegetables, you know, celery masala, medjool dates. I mean, I start to go, huh, I really want to try that. And I'm not necessarily saying, yeah, but I'd love a piece of salmon on there. So again, paradigm shift. And imagine the look on your customer's face as they see this. And imagine as you, as the chef, get to explain it to your customers and really make them understand what you're doing is for them and the planet. And oh, is this delicious. Now, real quickly before we move on, take a look at the menu on the left again. It's not that this menu is 100%, you know, vegetarian, vegan, etc. You can see on the right there is one fish, and on the right there are a few options for organic meat. But again, the rock stars are the vegetables, and this is a very much of a plant forward menu. I just love this. Now, if this doesn't sort of get your creative juices flowing, I don't know what else. So, you know, these are incredible ideas. And what I love about this is this, you know, whatever restaurants you're working in, whatever part of food service you aspire to be in, you can implement these same ideas of plant forward and plant based, whether you're, you know, 3-star Michelin, or whether you're you know, fast casual fast food even. And these are just some ideas in front of you. We don't have time to go through all of these, but oh my goodness, I mean, you know, the whole idea of, you know, cauliflower on a vertical roaster, you know, like a doner kebab. I mean, that's that's really pretty cool. Or, you know, vegetable based tacos, or these great eggplants, as you see on the sort of the bottom left there. I believe the one on the top right there is celery root, if I'm not mistaken. That's roasted and brought to the table and then sliced afterwards. There are so many things that you can do here. And again, the plant kingdom is such an amazing impetus for creativity. So what can you do? What can you do? And this is, again, this is a checklist for you, which we're not going to go through each of these. But again, I encourage you later to look at this and to say, what can I do at work? What can I do at home? I mean, we all live these two lives, right? Where we cook professionally, and then we cook in our homes also, and for our families. How can we do this? So, how can we look at our menus? Are they sustainable? Could it be healthier? How do we do it? What can you change tomorrow? What can you change in 3 months? What can you change in a year? What about those local, producers? What about how can we get in touch with them? What about food waste? We talked about that before. We spent a whole day on food waste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you're at home, how do you buy food for your family? How do you teach others? One of the things that we do at World Chefs that I'm so proud of is that we take the time to teach people all over the world, not just those of you who are joining us now, but literally, like, we've gone into high schools and grade schools and taught over 30,000 people about food waste. So you as a chef, what can you teach about to your neighbors about how to do things at home in a more plant forward, more plant-based way? So we wrap up here, and that is, eating well, it's good for you and it's good for the planet. But the really big thing here is, so like we've said in the other 7 of these that we've done, so now what do you do? What do you do with what we've just discussed and learned? Because if you sort of click off of this presentation in a few minutes and say, that was interesting, and go back to the way you've always been doing things, have we actually done anything? Has it actually made an impact? Because the only way we change the world is for each of us to do our part. And so I challenge you, what can you do at work and what can you do at home to make food that is more nutritious for yourself, your family, your customers? And at the same time, by doing that, cook in a way that's more sustainable for the health of the planet. So the challenge is now for you. And by the way, we would love to hear about what you're doing and maybe the ways that it's impacted you. At the same time, for those of you who are trainers, this is also available to you now. So you can look at slide number or presentation number 8 and add that to the 7 you already have to teach people all over the world. And let me just say that right now we have 326 people on here all over the world. I don't know how many countries, it's probably 40 or 50 countries. And if we think just for a second about how many people we all can touch in our worlds, in our spheres of influence, we can do amazing things as chefs, and we can truly change the world through the power of the white jacket. So the challenge is yours. I also want to just give credit to the folks who helped us with this presentation. As I mentioned with the other presentations, the first thing we did is to reach out to experts and ask experts to help us, because none of us know everything. And there was always people who are much smarter than all of us out there. So, these are the folks who really came up alongside us and helped us develop this module. They did a lot of the heavy lifting, and they deserve a lot of the credit.